There have been psychological experiments. For instance, perhaps you're aware of the one that was done at Yale, where students were brought in and asked to shock a subject if they gave the wrong answer on a test. And it turned out that the subject was actually working with the experimenter, but the students didn't know that. And it turned out that when asked to do so, the student would, something like 70% of the students would kill the subject, to put the shock up so high that he would actually die. And why? The psychologists determined that it was because of the authority thing. And I wonder if something like that could be applied to these big political things, that when you have a government in power, that the psychological power there is so great that they can cover up something like this. And even though people, it's like the emperor with no clothes. Even though people can see that it's wrong, no one will admit it. What do you think about that, Charles? Is that possible?
Well, I think the emperor with no clothes is of course quite interesting, and you're dealing with the power of public opinion, what people think, other people think, and the way this gets mediated is of course through television, through broadcast medium, through radio. And those mass media outlets have, one might say, conspired or certainly have been unanimous in avoiding a discussion of alternative theories for the events of 9/11. And and that kind of creates this consensus in which other people feel, well, I guess even if I have doubts, I'm an outlier, I'm marginal, I better just keep quiet about that. You mentioned psychological experiments. There's been another history of experiments in which people are put in rooms with Confederates, and they'll be the sucker, as it were, and the Confederates, and they'll be shown lines, colors, circles, and they'll be asked which are larger, which are longer, and the Confederates are scripted to say that the shorter line is longer than the longer line. And after a few repetitions of this, the victim, the innocent, tends to agree with what the consensus, the developing consensus, has been. And simply out of a sense of feeling as if they need to conform to the group opinion. And I think what we have, as of course George Orwell indicated, we have a system in which public opinion is so mediated by the media, and that media is so concentrated, and it's so possible to shape the historical record, that it becomes quite difficult for people to simply say, okay, I'm going to stand against the tide, I'm going to work against the grain, I'm going to stand against the flow of the current and argue for an alternative explanation.
I have, if you don't mind me jumping in here.
Sure.
Part of what Charles is saying is something that's kind of always bothered me, and it's the whole common sense aspect of each crime site. Okay, if you removed all the media, if you removed all the newspapers and all the things that people are telling you, and you showed somebody who didn't know any one of these crime sites, okay, I want you to watch this video of this building and tell me what you think. Everyone's going to say, if they look at Building 7 going down, it's controlled demolition. It's just common sense. They're not going to come up with any other theory. If you show somebody the place where Flight 93 supposedly was supposed to have crashed into the ground, you show them that hole with no plane wreckage around it, nothing there, you say, what is this? They go, I don't know, it looks like something might have blown up there or somebody dug a hole. They're not going to say a plane crashed there. It's just common sense. It doesn't look like a plane crashed there. Same thing with the Pentagon. You show somebody a picture of the Pentagon, say, what happened to this building? They're not going to say a giant jumbo jet crashed into that building. They're going to say it looks like something exploded there. It's all common sense. And I mean, there's a saying, if it smells like fish, it's probably fish. Well, the media and just the massive amount of propaganda has overwhelmed common sense in all of these crime scenes to have everybody, well, most people, believing whatever they want you to believe. And it goes against common sense in every one of these cases.
That's an important point about the media. We're on public access TV here. None of us get paid. We don't have corporate sponsors.
I'm not getting paid.
No. But the mainstream media, you never hear anything about 9/11. Well, why? The big corporations, they don't want that. The moneyed, America is a plutocratic oligarchy. The money, power, interest behind the corporations, they control the money going into the, if the TV show doesn't do what they want, there's no more money and they're off the air. This is why you aren't hearing about 9/11 on the mainstream media.
Terry, if I could just add briefly to that, there are, of course, rare instances when you do hear about 9/11 through the mainstream media, but in almost every case, they are very careful to bring out some psychologist or some other sort of mental health person to explain briefly why those of us who even question the official account of 9/11 have a psychological need to do this, and there's something wrong with us or defective about us. And they've gone so far as to suggest in several cases that we have a need to believe that a force like Al-Qaeda couldn't have done such a thing because Al-Qaeda is so powerless and it scares us. They suggest that we feel better believing that perhaps a few rogue members of our own government did this to us and covered it up. Well, I'll tell you one thing, I don't feel better thinking that. And I don't think anybody here does. But the point is, when they do deign to go into this area, they very carefully point out how crazy we must be. And they never, absolutely never, address the actual facts.
Well, you're making my point there. The mainstream media is a spokesperson for the oligarchy that rules America, and they represent that point of view. And of course, they want to just silence all of us who want a new investigation of 9/11. Now, Pete made a good point here. He said that after the planes hit the buildings, nobody picked up the pieces. But there was one piece they picked up. You know, they picked up the passport of Muhammad Ali on the street in New York. Imagine after those planes hit the buildings and all this fire and all this heat, which they claim melted the metal girders of the building. The passport falls down through all that and lands on the street so you can read it and find out who did that. What do you think about that? Is that possible?
That certainly is. That is so incredible. I think that perhaps that was overreaching on their part, laying those pieces of the story for folks to come along afterwards and somehow link together. But there was one other thing that came to mind as we were speaking earlier, in terms of the conflict between the analysis or the story and what people's direct observations were. In order for the theory of the collapse of the buildings to be plausible, one has to assume that there was a raging inferno in the entire structures, such that all of the support integrity of those buildings collapsed simultaneously. Now, what we know, and that's of course what the NIST analysis would have us believe. What we know, however, what we've seen is people standing at the windows, sadly jumping in many cases, in environments which were not on fire, which were not hot, in which there was no heat to melt the metal. We have survivors who came from the 81st floor, and the plane hit in the south building, I think it hit the 96th floor, but they walked down. We have firemen that walked up to the 76th floor and talked about the casualties that they saw and radioed this information back, to their controllers. This was an environment which was not generally on fire, and everybody could see this if they sort of gave credence to the evidence in front of them, but they tended not to. They tended to say, okay, well, nonetheless, somehow the whole building is turning white hot and it's going to collapse. Very strange.